Hello and welcome to Marketplacer. In today's video, we're going to be building the foundational components of a connected integration, which means we're going to flow third-party products through from Marketplacer through onto commercetools for you to sell on your commercetools platform to your consumers. So it's going to be a fairly technical video today, lots of code, so let's not waste any more time and jump straight in. So yes, today we're going to be building a connected integration into commercetools. So just to contextualize our business requirement, as an online retailer that already uses commercetools to sell my own first-party products, I want to extend my product range and sell third-party products alongside my own. And why do I want to do that? Well, quite simply so I can delight my customers and possibly more importantly, so I can increase my revenue. So how am I going to do that? Well, probably comes as no surprise, the way you're going to do that is to use Marketplacer. All right, so let's take a look at the solution we are going to build. So starting on the left, we are starting with Marketplacer. And as I've already kind of mentioned, Marketplacer allows you to host thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of third-party products that are being sold by many different sellers. And you can then pull those products through from Marketplacer, surface them on your own e-commerce front end and sell those products to your consumers. And then when orders are placed, those orders will flow back through to Marketplacer for those individual sellers to fulfill those orders. Okay, so that's basically what we're doing today. And so in terms of what you're seeing on screen here, that is what Marketplacer is doing. It's the product repository initially, and then it's going to take orders from commercetools. So ultimately what we're wanting to do is flow products through from Marketplacer to commercetools and then flow orders back through to Marketplacer. And how we're going to do that is by building what we call a connected integration. And in today's video, I've elected to use the Microsoft Azure platform to do that. Now, it goes without saying that if you're not familiar with Azure, you could swap out Azure and use anything else really that you wanted to, AWS, Google Cloud, an on-prem solution. It's entirely up to you. I just happen to be using Azure today. It also goes without saying, if you're not using commercetools, you could be using some other front-end e-commerce platform as well. So even if you're not using Azure or you're not using commercetools, today's video should still be useful for you in terms of understanding the Marketplacer domain and how you can integrate into Marketplacer and build a connected integration. So let's just take a look at the data flows that we're going to employ. So Marketplacer allows you to set up a number of webhooks which will emit events basically based on whatever object you are setting those webhooks up on. So what you can see here is we're going to set up a webhook in today's video that will emit a product created event. So anytime a product is listed on Marketplacer, we will emit a webhook event related to that event. In terms of what we're going to build in Azure, we're going to stand up a Azure function, a HTTP trigger function. So webhooks are basically HTTP post requests in this context, and they are going to get sent to our Azure function. The Azure function is then going to do a little bit of magic, not that much magic actually, and it's going to call the create product API in commercetools. So we're going to be using the commercetools composable commerce API, and I've elected to use the REST variant of that API in today's video. Then the return path, we're going to use something called a commercetools subscription, and similar to webhooks, they emit events or messages, and in this case we're going to be listening for the order created message. In this case though, we're going to place that message directly onto the Azure message bus. Okay, so rather than an Azure function listening for HTTP traffic, this is a direct integration into Azure message bus. And of course it goes without saying, or maybe it doesn't, I will say it though, that if you're not using Azure, commercetools supports a number of different messaging systems on the main cloud providers such as AWS and Google Cloud, and that is fully documented on the commercetools website. But again, today I'm using Azure. What we're then going to do within our connected integration domain is create another Azure function. This time it's going to be a message bus trigger function, so it's going to listen for messages being placed onto the Azure message bus. It's going to do a little bit of magic with that order payload, and it's then going to create an order in Marketplacer using the operator API, which is a GraphQL based API. All right, so that is our primary data flows for our connected integration. More than enough to get our feet wet into building integrations into Marketplacer. So we've only got a few slides left, but I did want to just cover the build principles of what we're doing today. So it's mostly step by step. However, things like setting up your API keys, all that kind of stuff, I'm just going to refer you off to the relevant documentation. I think it's already been done elsewhere, so I'm not going to repeat that kind of stuff. And it's already very well documented on both the commercetools and the Marketplacer side of things. All the coding will be done step by step. The main aim of today's video though is to join the dots to prove all the integration concepts between Marketplacer and commercetools. Well, maybe not all of them, but the main ones, okay? So the idea is that we beat a path from Marketplacer through to commercetools and back again, okay? That's the primary thing I want to achieve today. And probably a rather obvious point, but this is not a complete production build. You can probably tell from the timestamp of today's video that it would not be the case, of course, okay? But it's going to give you more than enough information to get going into building integrations, okay, into Marketplacer. All right, think of it as an accelerator to kind of get you going. So with that being said, let's take a look at what you'll need to set up on commercetools before you follow along with today's video. The Getting Started documentation is a great source of all the information that you will need, but in a nutshell, you'll need to set up an API client on your commercetools instance. And that means you'll need a project key, a client ID, secret, the API URL, and an authentication URL. And optionally, when you are maybe setting up your commercetools instance, you usually get the option to set up some test data. I would recommend you do that and take that option. So it means you have like test orders already in there, test products, things like that. Although we will be doing that in today's video, it's always useful to have products and orders already there as well, so you can use them as a bit of a reference point. And then let's take a look at what you'll need to set up on Marketplacer before you get going with the build. Very similar to commercetools. Take a look at the Getting Started documentation for the Operator API, but in a nutshell, before moving on, you should have an API key and the API endpoint URL. And if, like me, you're using a staging environment, then you will also need some basic authentication credentials, but again, the documentation covers all of that. And while each instance of Marketplacer comes with a very simple product category structure or taxonomy, as we call it, you may want to set up your own, just so it's maybe more in line with your own business requirements, but not mandatory, it's an optional one. And then just moving on to the last two slides, I just want to very quickly compare at a very high level the two data models of both Marketplacer and commercetools. So looking first at products, in Marketplacer, we refer to a product as an advert. And so we have this concept of an advert object, but again, just think of it as a product. Each advert will then have at least one variant. It can obviously have more than one variant, but there is a one-to-many relationship from the advert object to the variant object. But the important point to take away from here is when you create an order in Marketplacer, you're actually creating an order using the variant ID. It's the variant that you actually purchase. And the variant will have attributes such as the SKU, barcode, the inventory position, that type of thing, okay? And then taking a look at the commercetools domain, I'm not going to say it's identical, but it's strikingly similar. You have this concept of a product, and likewise, you have a number of variants that can be attached to that product. So again, there's a one-to-many relationship between products and variants. And likewise, in a similar vein to Marketplacer, when you create an order in commercetools, you're actually creating orders using the variant, okay? The line items on the order are basically variants or were variants, okay? So it's exactly the same as Marketplacer, okay? So you can kind of hopefully draw some parallels between the two. I think it goes without saying that I've obviously only selected a very, very small number of attributes available on each object. To list out everything would be many, many videos of many, many hours in length, which I'm sure nobody would be too interested in watching. So I've just distilled it down to what you need to know about. The main takeout here though is when you create an order in Marketplacer, you need to do that using the Marketplacer variant ID. And so what we're going to have to do is when we create a product in the commercetools domain and we create the variant, we're going to have to populate the variant in commercetools and give it an ID, the variant ID of the variant in Marketplacer, so that when that order is placed in commercetools and it flows back through to Marketplacer, we have the ID that we need. And the way we're going to do that is to use the key attribute on the variant in commercetools. Moving on to looking at orders, we have this concept of an order object with line items, many line items, one-to-many relationship. Again, fairly obvious stuff. The main comment here I want to make is around the use of external IDs. And so what we're going to do when we ultimately come to creating an order in Marketplacer, we're going to tag the Marketplacer order with the order ID of the order in commercetools. Okay, so again, goes without saying, this is just a hugely simplified view of both models, but we will first create an order in commercetools, simulating somebody purchasing something on a front end. That order will traverse through our connected integration, hit Marketplacer, we'll create an order in Marketplacer, but we want to tie together both orders, okay? And the way we're going to do that is by using the external ID facility within the order object in Marketplacer. All right, so that is enough slideware. I think it's time we started coding. So just before we start with coding, I want to just call out a bit of housekeeping stuff. The first one is that over on the documentation site, I'm actually following this playbook here, the connected integration example into commercetools. And I'm really just following along with this playbook. In fact, we've already gone through the start here stuff, and we're in the next section, we're going to get going with setting up a webhook. And even when we come on to doing our Azure functions and indeed our webhook, there is code in here as well that I will be using. So if we scroll a bit further down, I've got all the code in here as well that I'll just be copying into our project rather than typing it all in, just to save a bit of time. And we will be using a mixture of other tools. The main one I'm probably going to be using outside of the main stuff we're developing is this one here. This is Insomnia. It's very similar to Postman, it's just an API test client. And I'm using this really to make some calls directly to Marketplacer as well as commercetools. And we'll cover that when we come on to that section. But again, same sort of rules apply. I am expecting that everybody has gone through and set up things like the API keys in the Marketplacer API and set up an API client in commercetools. Configuring Insomnia is pretty straightforward, and in fact we do have a video on how you can do that for the Marketplacer APIs. So moving on to our first solution component, and that is to set up a webhook in Marketplacer to trigger a product create workflow. And the way we're going to do that is logged into the operator portal, come over to configuration, come down to webhooks, and we're going to create an advert webhook. And again, just as a reminder, adverts are products in Marketplacer. So a new webhook, the type that we want is advert. I'm going to click enabled, make sure you do that, otherwise it will not be enabled. The event, I just want the created event, but you can select one of the others, or if you leave it blank, you'll get all of them. URL is obviously very important, and that will ultimately end up being the URL to our Azure function, but we don't have that at the moment, so I will fill it out, but not with our Azure function URL, just with a placeholder, but I'll do that right at the end of this section. I'll move on for the moment though, and I'm going to create a header. And this header is just going to contain a value that we'll validate in our Azure function to make sure we trust it, basically. So nothing too elaborate, so it can be anything you like, obviously. Marketplacer let me in, seems like a good one to me. We do allow HMAC keys, so that provides an additional level of security. And then finally, the section for the GraphQL query is effectively for shaping your webhook payload. So what fields do you want to come through with this webhook payload? Now, I'm not going to type that in. What I am going to do is come over to the playbook that I was talking about, and I'm pretty sure I have that in here. Let me just come down. It would help if I was in the right section. So set up webhook. Here we go. So got the code here already. Now this is just a GraphQL query that, as you can see here, will accept an ID, and we'll inject that ID. This is the object ID every time an event fires, and we'll, place it through this node query. Node queries are kind of generic, so we want to specify the concrete type that we want, and so we use this inline fragment to do that. So we actually want the advert object, and then we just specify the fields that we want. So we're pulling out the advert ID, the advert's legacy ID, which is basically a human readable form of the first ID, title, description, and then our collection of variants. And again, we're pulling out the ID, the SKU, and the count on hand. So I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to paste that in here. Now, in our API collections, we do provide a number of different examples for a number of different objects. And of course, you can update this to be more elaborate if you want. I'm just going to keep this relatively simple for now. So that really is all we need to do apart from the URL. We do need to fill that out. It is a mandatory field. Now, what do we put in there for the moment? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little test site called webhook.site. And that just gives you a test HTTP endpoint that you can use for things exactly like this. And I'm just going to copy the randomized endpoint that's given me, and we can use this for testing a bit later on. Now, I will call out this is a third-party product. This is nothing to do with Marketplace or so. If you are using this as well, then just bear in mind that any webhooks we send from Marketplace will go to this third-party application. So just be aware that you probably don't want to be sending any sensitive types of data. There shouldn't really be anything terribly sensitive about an advert or a product, but I'm just calling it out anyway. All right, so that looks pretty good to me. We'll click Save, and there's our webhook. And again, the most important thing to note, or one of the most important things to note, is the fact that you have this green tick here, and that just denotes that the webhook has been created. So let's test our webhook now. I just want to make sure it's working before we move any further. So I'll bring the endpoint onto screen so you can see any events firing into it. And the way I'm going to trigger the creation of a product or the creation of an advert is to do it using the Marketplace or Operator API. And I'm going to use this mutation here, the advert upsert mutation. And I'm not going to go through that in any detail today. There's a lot of documentation on how to do this on the API documentation website. I'm just going to fire this off to Marketplace, and that will create an advert for us, and we should get an event here. So if I just execute that, we get 200 response, that's looking good, and then we get a created event come in here. So I just move this off to the side. You'll see the payload that we have is basically the GraphQL query that we'd specified just a few minutes ago with, all the things that we expect. And you can also see here the auth key is being passed through as a header as well. And we obviously attach a few more headers as well, not just that one, but that's the one we actually added ourselves explicitly, okay? So that's all looking pretty good. Just before I move on though, what I want to just call out is if you come over to the webhook and you click on this little cross here, you can actually see the events that we sent out, okay? So here's the advert events, the create event, it's been sent. This is the status of it here. And if we drill through any further, you'll actually see the response that Marketplace got when we attempted that. And as it was a 200, it's all successful. Everything's looking pretty good. So that is our webhook setup. So what we're going to do next is to create our first Azure function, and that function is basically going to act as our webhook endpoint. So it's going to replace this fundamentally. It's going to do more than this, but it's going to replace it. So new tab, I'll bring up the Azure portal, and I'm going to create a new resource. So new resource, and I'm going to search for Azure function like that. And this is the one we want here, the function app. So select and click create. Then we just need to go through and fill this out. It's relatively simple. So I'm just going to select my resource group, which is CT tutorial. The name, you can give it any name you like, but I'm going to call this create product CT. CT stands for commercetools in this instance. I'm going to leave code selected as that's what we are going to be doing. Runtime stack is going to be .NET. Leave the version as version 6, long-term support, and I'm going to change my region to something a bit closer to where I am, Australia Southeast, but of course select the most appropriate region for wherever you are. I'm going to leave the operating system as Windows, and I'm going to leave the hosting plan as serverless. Okay, move through to storage. Create a new storage account, move through again. We want public access, monitoring. I'm going to disable application insights. I'm not going to be using that. On to deployment, we're not using GitHub Actions, no tags, so that takes us through to the end. Quick check, looks good, click create. And Azure will go away and provision that for us. So we just have to play a little bit of the waiting game until that happens. All right, so our deployment succeeded. Let's go to our resource and check it out. And we have essentially an empty function application. There aren't actually any functions on it at the moment. So if we actually come down to functions, you'll see that we don't actually have any. We really just have the, I don't really want to use the word container, but we do have the function app set up that will host our functions, but we don't actually have any as yet. And coming back to overview, just to clarify again that this is running at the moment, okay? So that's all looking pretty good. So what we want to do now is to actually create our function. As I've said, we've created our function app, but we don't actually have a function. And there's a number of ways you can do that. You can actually do it directly in the Azure portal. So if you click on functions, create, over here, yeah, you can develop in portal. Now that's okay, but for anything that's anything more than the simplest of simple, it's not the greatest of experiences in my view anyway, and that brings us on to the other options that we have, which I think are more favourable. VS Code or some other text editor. So we're going to be using VS Code, and the portal gives you some handy tips on what you need to set up in order to use VS Code as the editor in which you author Azure functions. The first thing you need is to install Node, and that's required because we actually use some NPM packages to run up our Azure functions locally when we're testing them, okay? So you do need Node installed, which I've already done, and you do need to install this Azure function in VS Code again, which I've already done. So don't really need to do anything else in Azure for the moment, so we can close that down. And what I will do is open a new instance of VS Code. Make it a little bit bigger. All right, so I'll just show you over in extensions, the extension that was mentioned there, the Azure Functions extension. So it's by Microsoft, it's almost 2 million downloads, so it's fairly obvious which one it is, okay? And that will give you this Azure icon in your instance of Visual Studio Code. And I've already logged in to my instance of Azure, okay? So you may need to do that step if you've not already done so. So I've already done that. So all I want to do now is actually create ultimately a function, okay? Some code. So down in Workspace, click on the little Azure Functions icon and then just create function. And that's just looking for a file location where you can put your code. So navigate somewhere suitable for you. I'm actually going to create a new folder for mine. I'm going to call it create product CT. It can be anything you like, of course. I'm going to create that and I'm going to select that. It then takes us through a little wizard. So we were going to be using C# in this tutorial anyway. .NET 6 runtime. This is a list of the function types or the trigger types. So we will be working with this one here later, Azure Service Bus topic. But for now, our first function is this one here, HTTP trigger. So it's basically a HTTP endpoint. I'm going to keep the function name the same. I'm going to keep the namespace the same. Access rights is function. And I'm going to open it in the current window. Now we'll go away and generate an empty project for us. Now if you get this pop-up, click restore, and all that's doing is just bringing in the dependencies that are needed to make this project work. Excellent. And the first thing I'm going to do is set up some new configuration for us. Okay, so over in local.settings JSON, I'm going to add some new configuration elements. And coming back to the playbook, we have the code here. So it's these four here that we're going to create. So I'm just going to copy that and paste those in here. Saves me typing. And I'll go through each one in turn. So this first one here, CT API endpoint, is basically the destination or the sort of base server route to your API client on commercetools, okay? So when we call the APIs, there will be further route information there, but just the base route, okay? So up to the .com. And in my case, that's Australia, so I'll populate that in a second. your region might be different. The project key, so that's something that actually gets appended on here. We build up a full kind of API route and project key forms part of that, but I'm just storing it separately as project key, and I'll fill that in for myself in just a second. These last two, we're going to leave them for the moment. We will fill them out eventually. And what they are is, this is basically the access token that the commercetools API requires, and we're going to populate that manually. Okay, we're not building any session management in this solution, just to keep it simple. So we'll populate that key manually a bit later. And then finally, this one here, when you create a product, you need to supply something called a product type. And again, that's just a value that we will generate outside of our solution. Again, just to keep it simple. But for now, I'm just going to populate these first two, and we'll move on after that. So as you can see here, this is my base endpoint, and I'm based in Australia, Southeast 1. Again, that may well be different for wherever you're based. And I'll just paste in my project key as well. Fantastic. Don't forget to save. And again, we'll come back and we'll fill out these last two a bit later. So the next thing I want to do is to prepare the groundwork for when we call the product create API in commercetools. And if I actually just bring on Insomnia onto the screen here, I have that already kind of selected here, and you can even, just out of interest, you can see the route up here. So it's a post request, we have the API URL, and we have the project key. So we're going to construct that in our code, and it's the product's endpoint. But what we're focusing in on this little section is, this is the very, very minimal payload that we're going to be sending. So the name of the product type, which I've already sort of mentioned, and we'll create that a bit later, and then a slug. Okay, and this is really the minimum data that you need to supply when creating a product, and that's all we're going to be doing today. So basically what I'm going to do next is construct a C# class that's basically going to be a representation of this JSON object, okay? And again, just coming back to the tutorial, I already have that class here. So I'm just going to copy the code. Over in our project though, I'm going to create a place for that. So I'm going to create a folder called DTOs for data transfer objects. In our DTOs folder, we're going to create a new file. And we're going to name that file ct product create dto.cs. Okay, and I'm just going to paste that code in from the tutorial. I feel it's fairly straightforward. Again, it's really just replicating or mirroring the JSON payload that we're going to send. It's just a nice C# typed class though, okay? And we're using Newtonsoft JSON library. So here are the JSON property names, okay? Fairly straightforward, I think. So save that off. So next up, what we're going to do is we're going to create the method that's actually going to call the commercetools product create API. And we're going to create that in this file here, http trigger1cs. And we're going to create it after the main run method. And again, I don't like cutting and pasting code, but I just feel I don't think you would want to watch me type this out. So this is our create commercetools product async method. Okay, so let's just copy it in for the moment, and then we'll go through what it's doing. But really, it's very straightforward. It's a fairly simple method. Let's paste it in, just format our codes. Okay, and we do need to bring in some namespaces. So the first thing we need to bring in is the namespace for our DTO. So control and period to bring in the relevant namespace. String content will require, let's try that again, system.net HTTP. Encoding, I think it's system text. Yeah, bring that in, and I think that's it. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so what it's doing is it's accepting a DTO. Okay, and we're going to construct that up here in our run method a bit later, but that's what it's going to take as an input. We're then just going to create a HTTP content object, which fundamentally just serializes that class, that object, and provides some other parameters such as the encoding method and the scheme here. We're then going to create a HTTP client, and we're going to add a header to that client, and you can see here where it's an authorization header. It's going to have a bearer token, and we're going to pull out the CT bearer token value from our environment, and that's just the stuff that's stored in local settings JSON. We will await the response. We'll do a post async, so an asynchronous request to our endpoint. And you can see here we're just constructing the URL to that particular endpoint, okay? And we're passing over the HTTP content that we created up here. And then all we're going to do, very, very simple, we're just going to see if it's successful. If it is, it's true. Otherwise, we return false, okay? So that's really all this method is doing. It's really just a HTTP post request that's being made. All right, so what we want to do now is we want to update our run method to actually call this. Well, we're sort of going to do that. We're not quite going to do that. We're going to lay the groundwork for it because I want to test this sort of before we just get onto that. So I'm going to delete the entire contents of the run method. And again, I'm going to start pasting code in, but I'm going to do it in little sections. I'm not going to paste the whole thing in. And let's get started with doing that. So the first thing I want to do is when we receive, so this run method runs when we get either a get or post request, okay? So let's say it's going to be a post request because that's what we're expecting. I'll just format the document. So we're going to check the headers, okay? So we're going to look for this here, this header key, auth key, and then we're going to check this value. If it's marketplace or let me in. If it is, then, or if it isn't, excuse me, then we still return a 200, but we're going to give a little message saying good try. And the reason we're returning a 200 is if the marketplace or platform gets anything other than a 200, it keeps retrying the webhook, keeps retrying to send it, which makes sense. But in this case, this condition, it doesn't really make sense to retry because if you're not providing the authentication key, typically you're not going to be providing it ever, really. That might not always be the case, but generally I think that's going to be the case. So in this case, we are just going to return back a 200, just so that we don't get lots and lots of retries that we don't actually need. Otherwise, we keep going. And the first thing we're then going to do, or the next thing we're going to do, is we're going to deserialize the webhook payload that we get. So we'll use Newtonsoft JSON for that. And so here we're basically taking the request body, and we're reading it to the end, and we are deserializing it as a dynamic object. So we could, I guess, create a read DTO so that we have a nice statically typed class, but again, in the interest of time, I'm just doing a dynamic deserialization, putting it into an object called payload. Now, just coming back to webhook.site, this is the payload that we're going to get from Marketplace or here, okay? So you can see that there's an ID, and that's really what we're going to be printing to screen. There's also this thing here, the event name, which, as you can see, was create. So we're also going to do a little bit of a check for that as well. And if it's not a create event, then we're basically not interested in it. So that's this next bit of code I'm just going to paste in. Okay, so if the payload event name is not create, then we will just, again, we'll return a 200 to say that it's not a create event. And again, the reason we're returning a 200 is if we return, a 400, then Marketplace is going to keep retrying to send that webhook event. We just don't want that because in this case, it's completely pointless. Next thing we want to do is basically construct a DTO. So we've got our payload, it's a create event, it's been authorized, it's all looking pretty good. This line here, we'll just write out the product title to the screen just so we have it and we can sort of see it. And then we'll create a new DTO object with the various attributes that are contained within the payload. And again, for product type, we're actually using the configuration value that is stored in our local settings JSON file. Now we could create our products on Marketplace so that they have these product IDs mapped somewhere, but again, in the interest of simplicity, we're just pulling it from config. The other things, the title and the slug we are populating. Now, one thing to note about the slug that you provide to the commercetools API is it needs to be unique. Okay, if you don't provide a unique ID, you're going to get a non-200 response. So to get around that, I'm just using the legacy ID of the product in Marketplace, which will be unique. It's not a great value to use, but again, it's just a quick and easy way to represent a unique value. And then lastly, well, not lastly, just for the moment, what we're going to do, and you'll see I'm going to paste in some commented out code, which might look a little bit strange, but I will come back to that in a second. We're just going to return for the moment an OK result. So we're not actually doing anything. We're not actually ultimately calling this just at the moment. We will do, and that's what this commented out code is. So when the time is right, we are going to call it, and we're going to make a call to create commercetools product async with our DTO, and if it's successful, then we're going to return this, 200, product created. Otherwise, we're just going to return a bad object result. So in this occasion, if this call to this does not go well, we are going to return a non-200 result, because it's conceivable that retrying might rectify that, might have some chance of succeeding. But again, at the moment, we have just got that code commented out and we're just returning an OK. So in just a second, we're going to run this up locally and we're going to test it out. And don't forget to save your file though, just before we do that. So let's test our function out locally, and the way you do that is just by hitting F5, or maybe depending on your keyboard setup, function F5 or something like that, but F5 basically, and that will start up a local instance of our Azure function, and we should get a localhost endpoint that we can play around with. And indeed we do, so localhost port 7071 API, blah blah blah. Now you might be going, can we copy this and can we come over to webhooks over here, and can we update this endpoint here and start testing with it here? Answer to that is no, you can't. You can't have a localhost address in here. It has to be non-localhost. So just thought I'd call that out. So the way we're going to test it locally then is to use Insomnia. So where's my Insomnia client gone? There it is. And if I pull it onto screen here, what I'm going to do is just make a direct call, post call. So simulating a webhook event basically. And I have this payload here. And this payload, come back to webhook.site, is basically just a variation of this payload here. Okay, so this is the exact payload structure you'll get from Marketplace. So certainly up to here is the exact payload structure, and then everything in here will be dependent on how you describe your GraphQL query, but this kind of, well, I won't call them headers, but this kind of first section here, it will be the same in every case. All right, so come back over to here. No, we don't. If we come back over to here, I've just copied an instance of that. Okay, so if we move that off to the side, get rid of the taskbar, now just click send on that, you'll see that we get our function spring to life. And it's not yet attempting to call this method here, as we've commented that out, but it is pulling out the payload ID and the product title. So I really just wanted to test the JSON deserialization stuff, which is looking pretty good. So the last thing we want to do in this section is actually deploy our function to Azure, because at the moment the function app on Azure and the code in VS Code are completely divorced from each other, okay? So quite simple, come over to the Azure icon, down to the workspace, click on the little Azure function icon and then deploy function app. And you will need to be logged in to Azure in order for it to pull back your list of available Azure functions, and the first one here is the one that we want. Okay, create product CT. And it will go away and it will push that up, it will deploy that to Azure. Excellent, so that says the deployment was completed, so that's pushed our code up, but also what I want to do is upload settings. Okay, so again, this is all the stuff we put into the local app settings JSON file. So click on that, that will also push those 4 new attributes up to Azure. So if we come back over to Azure now, and we click on functions, you'll see that we have a HTTP function, which is cool. And if we come down to configuration, we should see that we have our 4 attributes that we put in. Here we are. Okay, and for things like the bearer token, it's just the placeholder value. For the actual endpoint, it's the actual value. Okay, so we'll come back and we'll update these a bit later, but I just wanted to make sure that you do actually push that config up so you don't have to recreate it manually. Excellent, so that's us done with the Azure function for the moment. We will of course have to come back and revisit it, but for the moment we're done with it, and now we can move on and take a look at the commercetools API. So what we're going to do in this section is work directly with the commercetools API, and the main reason we're doing that is, well, number one, just so you can see the API working outside of the context of code. And the second reason is that we're not going to build every single feature into our Azure function just in the interests of time. And the main feature that I'm really thinking in is session management. Okay, so we're going to generate our access token manually using Insomnia by directly calling the authentication endpoint. It's maybe something we'll build into future tutorials. So what you can see on screen here is an instance of Insomnia, and what I'm particularly showing you here is a call to the authentication endpoint, and you can see how it's composed. We need to pass through the client ID and the secret, and then we need to build up the URL to this particular endpoint, which includes your region and then a few other things in the query string, specifically the grant type, which in this case is client credentials, and the scope. And the scope in this case is just something along the lines of manage project for my particular project ID. And so when we make a call to this endpoint, we will get a new access token. So let's just do that now. And you can see now I have my new access token. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, and we're going to use this a bit later in our Azure function, specifically in our Azure config, so that when it comes to making API calls, it's using a valid token. Just another point to make, this token does expire in 48 hours, so by the time this video is produced and available, this token will have well and truly expired. So with our bearer token generated, it means we can actually start making API calls to the commercetools API. I mean, we did make one just there, but this is really to the authentication endpoint. What we can now do is actually make API calls to the rest of the API. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create a product type ID. And again, we're not building this into our Azure function, just again, simply in the interest of time. It is a relatively straightforward API call, but building it into the Azure function would just add extra complexity and time. So what you can see on screen here is how the API URL is composed. We've got the API URL, the project key, and then it's the product types resource. In terms of the access token, I'm just passing that over as a bearer token. And off camera, I've kind of updated my Insomnia environment file to contain the new bearer token we just generated a few minutes ago. All right, and then in terms of the body, we just supply a name for the product type. I'm just going to call this clothing and give it a very simple description. So if we click send, you can see that we have a new product type generated for us, and all we really need to supply is this ID when we are creating products. So again, I'm just going to copy this off and set it aside for the moment, and we will update our Azure config with this value. But before we start working with our Azure function again, I do just want to create a product manually using the Insomnia client. So again, I've got that configured over here, create product. And you can see this is the payload that we're passing over. And the structure of the payload will probably look a bit familiar to you. This is basically what we've built into our Azure function. And it's really the minimum set of data that you'll need to supply to create a product in commercetools. But again, this data, as I'm sure you can imagine, would not be sufficient for us to then go ahead and actually purchase this particular product. We don't even have variants attached to it, as we've kind of discussed. So since we're kind of dealing with the clothing domain, I might change the values here to something else, such as the red t-shirt, and put in our product ID that we just generated in the last section. So I'm just going to copy that over here. And then finally the slug. Now the slug needs to be unique. Okay, you will get an error. In fact, I'll demonstrate it. So if I just say red, I'll put it all lowercase, red t-shirt. Okay, this should generate a product for us successfully, fantastic, and it's got a whole load of attributes. Most of them are empty, but if we try and create that again, we will get a bad request, and it's basically saying that the slug is not unique. Okay, so that's, again, I've called that out previously, but that's something you need to be aware of when you are creating products. So the API call itself is pretty simple. So with that demo complete, I think we're now ready to go back to our Azure function and number one, update the config and also just make some minor changes to the code, and then we can test this end to end. So bringing our Azure function back onto screen, the first thing I want to do is just complete this configuration. Okay, so let's just fill in the product type. That's still in my clipboard, just make sure that is the right value, and I'll also paste in my current bearer token. Now, of course, one thing to really bear in mind is we're not really doing session management here at all. This is completely manual, and it's conceivable, highly conceivable, in fact, that when you run this, it's going to work fine, hopefully, but leave it a couple of days and then it will stop working. Okay, and you'll have to refresh the token. So just bear that in mind if you're playing around with this. All right, so that's our local settings updated. The other thing we want to come back and do is just to uncomment this stuff here. Okay, and this is actually making a call now to our create commerce tools product async method. And I'll just take out commentary here, and I'm going to comment this out as it's now redundant. And of course, don't forget to save both your config and your code. So what we want to do now is we want to run this up locally, and we're going to then simulate a webhook request coming into it. And it should actually, assuming we've done everything correctly, create a product in commercetools. Of course, it won't be working off of actual webhooks just yet, but we will be coming on to that very shortly. So again, we want to run this up. And we have our endpoint as before, and then just going to bring Insomnia back onto screen, and I might make this a little bit smaller now. And what I'm going to do, as we've done before, is I'm going to make a call to our local Azure function and simulate a webhook, product create webhook. And this is kind of what we're going to expect here. So I might leave that as it is, platinum t-shirt, that sounds good. And as you can see here, I've been playing around with different things. So this is a great t-shirt, although it makes absolutely no difference, but it was just annoying me. And yeah, we can simulate a webhook in here. Okay, looking pretty good. And bringing the commercetools merchant center onto screen here, if we come over to products and our product list, we should hopefully see a platinum t-shirt, and it's unpublished. So I'm going to actually delete these two things here, which are ones I've been playing around with before. I'm going to delete these, and we'll just try it again, just to double confirm that everything's working correctly, and they weren't things that were there already. In fact, let me just change this to something else, like gold t-shirt, which sounds absolutely horrible, but let's try it again. Okay, cool. And bring commercetools back on here. If you just refresh the merchant center, you should see that we've got a gold t-shirt. And again, it's unpublished, okay, but nonetheless, that is really essentially our first flow completed. But we've only tested this locally, and really what we want to do is we want to test it fully end-to-end with using a webhook, and we also therefore need to deploy our function back up to Azure. So let's do that now. So I'm just going to stop this from running. Hit any key to terminate it. And I'm going to redeploy. And we've already deployed this, but we'll go through the steps again. So click on the Azure icon, come down to our Azure icon here, deploy function app. It's the create product CT, Azure function, and we'll click deploy, and then we'll just have to wait for that to deploy. And the other thing, of course, that we will need to do is also push the config up to make sure that we have a bearer token and the product type ID. Excellent, so our deployment succeeded, and then don't forget to upload settings. Yep, we're going to overwrite it. And this one, yep. Okay, so that is our settings successfully updated on Azure as well. So I'm going to move this off to the side. I'm going to move this off to the side. And the next thing we're going to do is in Azure, we're going to get the endpoint URL for our Azure function. And while we're there, we'll also just check that the config was successfully pushed up too. So bringing the Azure portal back onto the screen here, I've already got my Azure product create function selected. And the first thing I want to check is just to make sure that the configuration was actually pushed up when we deployed it. Fairly confident that it has, but it's always worth checking these things. So yeah, there's now a bearer token there, and there's now a product type ID there as well, whereas before it was just sort of placeholder values, wasn't it? Excellent. And then the only remaining thing to do here is to actually get the endpoint of our function. Okay, so select functions, select HTTP trigger 1, and then what we want to do here is get the function URL. Okay, and I'm just going to copy that. And this value is the value that we're now going to put into Marketplace. So when it actually does generate a genuine webhook, we're going to get traffic sent to this function. So no time like the present, let's pull our instance of Marketplacer back onto the screen, back in the operator portal, configuration, webhooks, and here's my webhook. And again, you can see it's using the old webhook.site tool. We're just going to update that now. So edit, and then I'm going to paste in my new endpoint here, like that. Everything else looks okay, so we can save that off now. So theoretically, we now have webhook traffic going to our Azure endpoint. So all we can do now is to start to create adverts directly in Marketplacer and see that traffic flow through. And what we can do down here is we can actually see that traffic flow through. So you can see here, I just have one event that was generated a couple of days ago when I first started recording the video. So if we simulate an advert create to this instance of Marketplacer, we should start to see some activity. So bringing our old friend Insomnia back onto the screen here, what I'm going to do is come back to my Marketplacer collection and we're going to create an advert or create a product. And I might rename this to, well, we're going with precious metal themes, so let's use silver this time. And to be honest with you, this is actually the only thing, well, two things are propagating through to commercetools. This one here, the title, and when the advert is actually created, this thing here, the legacy ID, I'm using that as the slug. Okay, now this is not a great value for a slug. It really should be like a kind of alphanumeric descriptive type thing, but just to keep it simple and to ensure that our slugs are going to be unique, I'm passing this over. So let's create a product. That looks successful. We got product ID and a legacy ID here, so that's looking pretty good. So maybe just take a note of this actually. The legacy ID is, I'm not going to attempt to read that out, but I'm going to copy it off so we can have a look and see if that's the slug value that we have over in commercetools. Before we get too excited though, let's see what has happened over from a webhook perspective. So if we expand that, it's looking quite good. So we've got a second event here generated today, which is the 19th of July, and we've got a sent status. So again, drilling through, we can actually see that we got a product created response back from our Azure webhook. Okay, so that's looking pretty good to me. And bringing the commercetools Merchant Center back onto screen, if we refresh this, we should hopefully see a silver t-shirt having been created. Indeed we do. And what we can also do is we can actually use the commercetools API to retrieve products as well. So coming back to Insomnia, down to commercetools, down to products. Let's use this one here, get products, plural. Okay, so this will get all the products on our instance. And we can run that. We've got a limit of 20, we've got 15 products, and what I might do is just do a quick search for the SKU value, not SKU value, the slug. Okay, and you can see down here that we have a product down here that has that particular slug, and it's the silver t-shirt. So I'm fairly confident that our product flow is now working end to end. So just before we move on to the next section, it's probably a good time to do a bit of a review to see what we've achieved and to see what we have yet to complete. So here's our three kind of domains. And what we've done thus far is this flow here. We've created a webhook in Marketplacer that emits a product create event. The Azure function takes that, does a little bit with it, and then it creates a very basic product in commercetools using the commercetools API. And as I've already mentioned, and as you've already seen, the product that we create in commercetools is very basic. You can't actually create an order with that product. We need to add a lot more data to it. Now, there's no reason why we can't elaborate our webhook to supply that data and update our Azure function to do all that stuff. But in the interest of time, I've kept it very bare minimum. I feel putting all that extra detail in a video like this would be quite boring. So that's probably something you can achieve yourself now. I think you've got enough knowledge to be able to do that. So in the next few sections coming up, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be working with commercetools subscriptions, and they work in a similar-ish way to webhooks. Basically, they emit events as well, or messages, and we're going to be working with the order created event. So the idea is that someone has actually placed an order for the product or products we've just created in commercetools, and those orders are going to flow back through into Marketplacer. Subscriptions in commercetools, as already discussed, are slightly different from webhooks in that they traverse message systems directly. So in this case, we're using Azure Service Bus, and we're going to have an order created message placed directly on to that bus. We're then going to have another Azure function that's going to take those messages, and then in turn it's going to create orders in Marketplacer using the operator API. Okay, so in the next section, what we're actually going to do by way of a bit of scaffolding is to actually create the Azure Service Bus. So let's bring our old friend, the Azure portal, back onto screen here, and we're going to create an Azure Service Bus. So come up to Create Resource and just type in Azure Service Bus. And I'll probably apologize in advance, or I might have already done it, to be honest with you. I might refer to this as a message bus. I might use Service Bus and Message Bus interchangeably. So I apologize if I do that, but it is the Azure Service Bus that you want. So click on that, click Create, and as before, it's pretty straightforward. Just select your resource group. Let's give it a name. So I'm going to call this CT, as in commercetools, new orders. And I think that should be okay. Fantastic. Location, certainly for me, is Australia Southeast. Of course, you will select whatever region is closer to you. And then this last one here is actually really important for what we are doing, and that is to select the standard pricing tier. And the reason we're not going with basic is that we're going to be making use of topics and subscriptions, and they are not, certainly at the time I made this video anyway, they're not available at the basic tier. So we need to select standard. But you can see here it's roughly $10 US per 12 million transactions per month. We are not going to be going anywhere near that. We might have like 1 or 2 transactions. So I think pricing is basically going to be negligible in our case. Let's move through the wizard. Leave TLS at version 1.2. Networking, we do want public access. Tags, we don't need tags. So we will just review and create. Once you're happy, and as before, we click Create, and that will just go away and provision our Service Bus namespace for us. Excellent, so our deployment has succeeded. Go to the resource. And what we want to do next is to create a topic. Okay, and so you can have multiple topics on the given Service Bus namespace, one for orders, one for products. So in fact, that's a good point. We could adopt a Service Bus for our product flow. I've just chosen not to do that on this occasion, but you absolutely could introduce something like that. Anyway, we're going to create a topic for orders, like so, and the other settings are fine. But you can see here, just if you've not worked a lot with something like Azure Service Bus, that the messages that get placed on there, actually, you can configure how long you want them to live for. So again, these type of things are really good for improving the redundancy in your applications. So if parts of it go down, then you don't lose orders, for example. In the case of an e-commerce setup, that would be very, very important, of course. You don't want to lose orders. That would be financially impacting, of course. So a good technology to use. But other than that, things are looking pretty good. So we'll just click Create for our topic. And that was much quicker, successfully created. And I'm going to select my topic down here. And then select orders. And then the last thing we're going to do by way of configuration is we're going to create a subscription. So the idea is we're going to create an Azure function eventually that's going to subscribe to the subscription effectively. And so when messages are placed on to the topic, the Azure function will pick up those messages via the subscription. Okay, so click on subscription. And we're just going to select the name as S1. Again, you can give these any names you like, but if you want to follow along, keep it consistent. All the other settings are fine, so we'll just click Create. Now, one of the things that we need to do when we set up a subscription in commercetools, we actually use the commercetools API to create a subscription that points to this service bus. We need to provide an access policy or a connection string effectively to commercetools so that it can actually have the permission to publish or to send things onto the message bus. So the way we do that is to make sure that your orders topic is selected, not the service bus namespace. So in fact, what I might do is I might come back here and tell you what not to do, and that is this is the service bus namespace, okay? And you can see here that you have shared access policies. That's not where you want to create anything. What you want to do is come down to your topic, select your orders, and then make sure your orders topic is selected. And it's here that we want to create our shared access policy. Okay, we don't have any as yet, so we're going to click Add. And we just want the ability to send. And let's call this commercetools. And we'll create that shared access policy. That's been created, so if we click on this, what we want is this primary connection string here. So I'm going to copy that to clipboard for the moment. Now it goes without saying that this detail here, everything you can see on screen here, is pretty sensitive, because if anybody gets hold of this, then it means they could theoretically, or not just theoretically, in actuality, they could actually start publishing things onto your service bus. So of course, these settings that you can see on screen here, they relate to a service bus that will be deleted by the time this video is published. So if you do try and use them, good luck, but they won't work. But of course, in the real world, you'd need to make sure that these settings were kept very, very secure. Fantastic. And to be honest with you, that's all we really need to do in Azure by way of our service bus. So having created our Azure Service Bus in the last section, what we want to do now is actually to create a subscription in commercetools. Specifically, the order created event is what we're interested in. So at the moment, if we created an order in commercetools, that's great and everything, and it would absolutely create an order, but it wouldn't place a message anywhere onto any message bus. We need to do that now. But just having said that, what I do want to check just before we go any further, just to make sure I'm not talking rubbish, is actually to check that we don't have any subscriptions already on the instance, because having been playing around with this project, it's conceivable I might actually have one lingering around. So the way I'm going to do that is to make a GET request to the subscriptions endpoint. And yeah, there are no subscriptions on there. That's cool. So again, I've fallen into that trap where I've had multiple subscriptions and it got a bit confusing. Anyway, that's cool. We don't have a subscription, so we want to create one now. And we do that using a post request to the subscriptions endpoint. And because I'm using Azure Service Bus, this is the shape of the payload that I'm passing over. So you specify a type, which in this case is Azure Service Bus. Again, all the documentation for subscriptions is on the commercetools developer docs. And if you're using another messaging platform, then you can find the type for that platform in that documentation. One point I do want to make though is that this is the shape of the payload because I happen to be using Azure Service Bus. If you're using one of the other platforms, you may need to provide additional or fewer elements in order to get that particular messaging platform working. In the case of Azure Service Bus, all you need to provide is the type and the connection string, basically. That's it. And the connection string was the connection string that we generated, or the shared access policy that we generated in the last section. So I'm just going to paste the new one in here, like so. And then this next section is quite interesting. It's not only is it interesting, it's critical. You specify the resource type that you're interested in. So in this case, we are interested in anything to do with orders. And going beyond that, you can then specify the types of message that you want. Now, if you don't supply this type field here, you'll get all message types for orders. So orders being created, orders being dispatched, all that kind of stuff. So I want to keep it simple and just filter it down to the order creation type events. And then finally, you just give your subscription any kind of key that you like. And I'm just going to call this Azure Queue in this particular instance. But again, do bear in mind if you're using a different messaging platform, your payload may look a little bit different. All right, so let's click send. That goes away and it creates a subscription for us. Okay, so we don't really need to do much more with this, but it looks pretty healthy. In fact, you can see here the status is healthy, so that's good. Now, one other point to bear in mind, what actually happens as a result of creating successfully, and again, HTTP 201, successfully creating a subscription in commercetools, is that actually, as part of that creation process, it places a message, a test message, onto the message bus. But it's not an order created message, it's a subscription created type message, okay? So at this point in time, we do actually now have a message live on our message bus, but it's just not of the type order created. But indeed, we can actually come back over to the Azure portal and, well, you can actually see here the little message spike. There's one message being shown here, incoming messages, one. Okay, so that is that message that we've just generated because we've created a new subscription. So that's there waiting for us. So when we, in the next section, create our next Azure function, it's actually going to go away and it will actually pick up that message. It won't be able to do anything with it. It won't be able to create an order with it, but it will get triggered by it. Okay, so just want to kind of call that out. Excellent, so that's our subscription created in commercetools. Our Azure message bus is set up. Really, all that's left to do is to create our last Azure function. All right, so back in our beloved Azure portal, we are going to create our final resource, and that is another Azure function. So click Create Resource, Azure function. It's the function app by Microsoft. We'll click Create. And again, this should be relatively familiar to you now, so I'm going to put it in the same resource group as before. I'm going to give it the name Create Order MP, MP standing for Marketplace on this instance. I'm going to leave it as code. Runtime stack is going to be .NET. Move this up a little bit. Version 6, long-term support is what we want. Again, region, select the one most appropriate to you. I'm going to select Australia Southeast. Operating system, Windows is fine, and the hosting option, consumption serverless, is what I want as well. So let's move on to storage. We're going to create a new storage account, that's fine. Click Next onto networking. Yep, public access is what we want. I'm going to say no to application insights. We're not going to use GitHub Actions. We're going to deploy directly from VS Code, but again, GitHub Actions are pretty cool. You can commit your code to GitHub, as you probably would do, and then that will trigger a build process directly into Azure. Quite nice, actually, but we're not using it today. So moving on to tags, no tags, and then we just want to review. So that's all looking pretty good to me. So we'll click Create and twiddle our thumbs until Azure deploys our function for us. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Our resource is created. Let's just go and check it out, make sure it's running. And indeed it is. Okay, cool. So we can set this to the side for the moment. And now what we want to do is to create our Azure project code in VS Code. So I want to start a new instance of VS Code. And this should just be review for you at this stage. It's very similar to what we've already done, but let's go through it again because we have to. So let's create the Azure icon, come down to the Azure function. We're going to create a function. And the first thing it's going to ask us for is a location where we want to put it. So I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it Create Order MP. And we'll create that, select that folder. And it will then take us straight into the wizard to create our function. So yes, C#, .NET 6 long-term support. This is where we diverge from what we've done previously. So rather than using a HTTP trigger, we want to use an Azure Service Bus topic trigger. So select that. I'm going to keep the function name the default, likewise for the namespace. In terms of our settings, local settings JSON is fine. And then it will go away and it will pick off the different service buses we have on Azure. And I'm going to use this one here, which is the one we just created, CT new orders. And then in terms of the topic, we do need to specify that. So if you remember, we called our topic orders, all lowercase, and the subscription was S1. And let's open that in the current window. And as before, VS Code will go away and scaffold that project up for us. And the first thing we want to do is to come over to our local.settings.json file, and we want to add in some new configuration elements, mainly so that we can talk to the marketplace or API. But just before we do that, I want to draw your attention to this. We have already got a connection string to our service bus created for us. And again, this is a highly sensitive piece of information, so you would not want to make this publicly available to anyone. And just on that point, you can actually see that we do get a gitignore file, and in here, local settings JSON is actually excluded or included in this file, so it's excluded from being committed to a Git repository. So you should hopefully not inadvertently push it up to something like GitHub or something like that. Anyway, coming back to the step-by-step tutorial, we're basically going to create these three configuration elements here. So I'm just going to copy the sort of placeholder code, and I'm going to come to the end of here, make sure there's a comma in here, and then paste these in. Let's go through them one by one. So this first one here, MP basic auth, this is only required if you're using a test instance of Marketplace, or most usually in that case, you need to supply basic authentication credentials. If you don't have basic authentication enabled, which might be the case, then you don't really need to include this, but that's up to you. Now, just coming back to the tutorial again, if you've not created a basic authentication header before, there's a little cutout here that just takes you through step by step how to do that. Basically, you take your username and password, you form them in this format here, so username, colon, password, you base64 encode it, and then your basic authentication header is basically this basic space and that base64 encoded string. Just an FYI, this is just a fake set of credentials I've got on screen here. And likewise for the key, that's going to be a key that I will delete after I've made this video. So I'm just going to populate these values now. And this last element here is just the endpoint to the marketplace or operator API on your instance of marketplace. So don't forget to put the /GraphQL route on the end of it. And because it's a GraphQL based API, there is only one route. It's not like REST where you have, different routes to the various resources. Okay, so don't forget to save that off. And we will of course be pushing this up to Azure as well when we come to deploy our function. So we can close that down and never look at it again. Let's come back into our Service Bus topic trigger file. So in a similar way to when we created our product create Azure function, we added a method to call the commercetools API to create a product. So we're going to do exactly the same thing here, except it's the other way. We are going to create a method in our class to create an order in Marketplacer. So we're going to create a separate method in our class to do that. Now there's quite a lot of code here. I'm going to cut and paste, but I'm going to do it in sections, okay, and explain each section as best I can as we go along. So inside our class, let's come after our run method. Let's just paste this in. Let's put in closing bracket and let's just format document to make sure that's looking good. Okay, that's cool. So first couple of things we do need to do is bring in some namespaces. So this is an asynchronous function that returns a task fundamentally. So control period to bring in system threading tasks. And likewise, we're using Newtonsoft JSON. So control period to bring in Newtonsoft JSON. Now the first two variables we're declaring are the variant ID and the commercetools order ID. And commercetools order ID is probably pretty obvious what that's going to hold. The variant ID, just as a bit of a reminder, when you create an order in Marketplacer, you actually pass over the Marketplacer variant ID to create that order. And in fact, if we look at an example of order create, this is the order create mutation going to the Marketplacer operator API. You can see down here in the line item section, it expects a variant ID. And this variant ID is the Marketplacer variant ID, and then all the usual stuff. Now again, just calling it, this is a very minimal example. There's lots of other ways you can configure this mutation, but we're just keeping it pretty simple for now. And the other thing you can see we're doing is we're going to attach an external ID to our order, and that is going to have this particular key here, although that could be anything you like, and the value is going to be the commercetools order ID. Now, just going to call out that the only dynamic elements we're going to pass over when we create our order in Marketplacer are the external ID value for the commercetools order ID and the variant ID for the product we want to purchase. Okay, everything else, the name, address, all that stuff, we are just going to hard code. Again, simply in the interest of time. To write the code to do all of that would just be a bit laborious and didn't want to do that. Okay, so that's just a bit of a call out. The second call out is that at this point in time, we have created a product in commercetools, but it was a very basic product. It's not fully formed or anything like that. So I think, as I've already said, what we're going to do, I just bring on my slide deck to the screen here, coming back to our product models. Let's have a quick look at this. Looking at the commercetools model, you'll have a product and you'll have multiple variants, or at least one variant. And again, like with Marketplace, so it's actually the variant that you purchase. So what we're going to do in a bit of a later section is take an existing product in commercetools, one that's purchasable, and we're going to add the Marketplacer variant to the key of one of its variants. Okay, we've not done that yet, but we will do that. Now, of course, we wouldn't need to do that if when we created the product in the first place, we passed over everything that we needed. But again, simply in the interest of time, we didn't do that today. So that is fundamentally what these two variables are for. And where do we get them? Well, we get them from our message that's been placed onto the Azure Message Bus. And that's basically what this body text is. That's going to be the body of the message from the Azure Message Bus. And here we're just using Newtonsoft JSON to dynamically deserialize that into an object called payload. Paste in our next bit of code. There's a bit of a formatting of documentation. Make sure I've put all the commas and brackets in the right place. It can get a bit precarious if you don't watch what you're doing. So in this next block of code, we're going into a try block. And the reason I put this in a try block is the fact that we may or may not get order messages onto our message bus. And that's actually what's happened in our case, because when you create a subscription, as I'm sure you remember, commercetools actually places a message onto the message bus that is not an order message. It's a different type of message. It will have a different structure to what we are generally expecting. So here, I'm trying to get the variant ID, and I'm getting it from the payload, from the order, from line items, the first line item, in fact, variant and then the key. So if we get a payload that doesn't have that structure, it's going to throw an exception. So I've just put it in a try catch block. For the most part, assuming we get order create messages, this should work fine. And then just circling back, the other thing to call out is that we are only getting the first variant in our line items collection. So if we create an order in commercetools that is more than one line item, then we're going to miss those line items. So again, simply in the interest of time, keeping it simple, we're just picking off the first one. You would have to circle back here, of course, and take into account if you had multiple line items. Second line, line 35, fairly straightforward, just getting the commercetools order ID, and then we're just printing some stuff out to screen. If there's any kind of exception, and there will be an exception thrown when we first start up our function, because it will pick off the subscription create message and it's going to not be able to deserialize this stuff, and it will just throw an exception. Lines 47 and 48, basically what that's saying is if either the variant ID or commercetools ID are empty, so okay, we've successfully deserialized it and we've sort of populated those values, I just want to double check that they're not empty. And so again, returning false. Next bit of code, this is fairly standard stuff, or relatively standard stuff now. We're going into the domain of just making HTTP requests, but before we come on to lines 56 and onwards, jumping back up to line 50, what we're doing is creating an object that's going to represent our mutation call. And the way I've structured it is effectively just as a horrible big long string. And that string is just a representation of this here. That's all it is. And as you can see, most of it is hard-coded. But if I scroll along a bit, you'll see that we are actually dynamically populating the commercetools order ID and the variant ID. Everything else hard-coded. Again, of course, not a production quality solution. You would have to fix that up. And I would say if you're using GraphQL, you wouldn't typically, I don't think you should typically make GraphQL calls like this. It's very messy. You'd want to use a proper GraphQL client. And there are some options in the .NET space as well as other frameworks. But again, in the interest of time, keeping it simple. Next, we're going to create a string content object. You've seen this already. We do need to bring in system.net HTTP, and we do need to bring in system text to support encoding in UTF-8, and that is just our HTTP content object with our mutation object serialized. Next, we are creating a HTTP client, and we probably need some extra lines in here. So we've got a HTTP client on the document, and we are going to add some headers. So again, as I've said here in this comment, this header is optional. If you're not using basic authentication, I am, so I'm going to add it in. This one is mandatory, which is the marketplace or API key. And again, we're just pulling out the variable marketplace or operator API key. And then we finally make a call, not finally, but next we make a call to the API by doing a post async, okay, and passing over our HTTP content, and we will get our response back. Almost there. Let's copy in the last of our code. Just format the document. So coming back to the last bit of code here, we check to see if we've got a response status code of success. If it's not, then we just return false. Assuming it returns a successful response, then we're going to actually read that response, which is something we didn't really do in the product creation leg. So we didn't really have a lot of detail about what was being created. So this time we are doing that. Again, we're going to deserialize that content to the content object. We'll write out to screen just so we can see what it is. And this is basically the response that's coming back from our marketplace or mutation call. So again, coming back to Insomnia, when you make the mutation call, you also specify what you want to come back. So we're going to bring back the error object with field and messages, and we're also going to bring back the order itself with an ID and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to look to see if the order object is null or is not null. Assuming it's not null, then that approximates to the fact we have a successful order. Otherwise, we're going to say that we had some kind of error. and we're going to print that out. So content object data order create errors, and that will tell us what was wrong with our order. Wow, okay, so that is quite a lot of code. Let's just save that off before we move on to the next section. So actually all we need to do by way of coding, there's not much left actually, in our run function. I'm just going to take out this line here, and I'm just going to paste in the code that we need here. So I'm just going to format the document, and again this code is in the tutorial, just cut that out, and I'm just console writing this out, okay, as opposed to logging it. And we're getting an error because we're using this await, our method here, create marketplace options is asynchronous, and we are quite rightly trying to await on it. What that means is we do need to update the signature of our run method, and rather than being void, it needs to become an async task. And that should get rid of that error. Cool, so we'll save that off. And that's basically our code complete, and our configuration is complete. So what I want to do now is run up a local instance of our function. And what I'm expecting to happen, just bring up our console, is that when this runs up, it will connect to our service bus and it will retrieve the message that is already there. And again, it's not an order create message, it's a subscription create message. So we're going to get a notification, but it's going to throw an exception. So F5. So excellent, just exactly as we expected. There was a message there, but it wasn't an order created message, it was a resource created message. And we've even got the key to what it was, which was the Azure queue, which if you remember was the key of our subscription that we created. The exception was thrown, so cannot perform a runtime binding on a null reference. So we have caught that in our try catch block, and we therefore say the order was not created. But that's highly successful from my perspective because it means we are actually getting messages from commercetools through onto our Azure function, albeit running locally. So I'm going to stop that for now, and I'm going to kill it. So with our local test successful, I think it's time to deploy our function up to Azure. So come over to the Azure icon here and click on the Azure function icon, and we're going to deploy our function app. And it will go away and it will retrieve a number of available functions on our instance of Azure, and this is the one I want here, create order MP. And we'll just confirm to deploy it. Now we will of course need to deploy our configuration as well, but we'll need to wait for our code deploy to complete first. Cool, so the deployment was successful. Now we just want to upload settings. That looks good too. And just to confirm, back over in Azure, let's come into our function. Let's come down to configuration. And yeah, we can see we have our 3 configuration elements configured. So that's all looking pretty good. So in this penultimate section, what we're going to do is we are going to attach a marketplace or variant ID to an existing commercetools variant. And this is something you wouldn't ordinarily do manually. It's something you would do as part of your product flow, which we just didn't implement today. So what I've got here is Insomnia, as you've seen already, and I'm going to perform an advert search query on my instance of Marketplacer, and I'm pulling out a particular seller that I'm interested in. So let's run that query, and okay, cool. So this seller has a number of products that we're interested in. Again, all of this data should be flowing through to commercetools. We just didn't do it. So here's a collection of variants. So here's a large variant of this particular product here. So I'm just going to copy that. And what we're going to do is we're just going to attach it to a commercetools variant. So bringing the commercetools Merchant Center back onto the screen here, we're going to attach a variant ID that way. So under products, product list. And again, just while that's loading, you can of course do this using the API. I just thought it would be a bit easier doing it this way. So in my product list, I already have a number of products that have been created for me when I elected to go with the sample project when I set up my commercetools instance. And I strongly suggest you do that as well, because it gives you this data that you can play with, and there are products here that we can actually purchase. If you didn't do that, or you don't have products that you can purchase, then you will need to create those. However, you decide to do that. And you may want to do that manually using the Merchant Center, or you might want to do it by expanding our product flow solution that we're working on here. Either way, you will need to do that. Anyway, this is the product I'm interested in here, the sample skinny jeans. Not that I can fit into skinny jeans these days, but let's select this product. It's been published. Let's have a look at its variants. We have 2 variants here, okay? And we're going to take this second variant and we're going to add a key here. So let's click on that. In the general attributes, we'll just paste in the marketplace or variant ID. Okay, that's cool. So let's save that. Been updated, and then go back to the variant list. You can see the product's been modified, so we want to publish it. Okay, and so what that means is we're going to now purchase this variant and create an order, and that data will flow through our Azure message bus through to Azure and hopefully into Marketplace, or so an order can get created. So yeah, everything should be in place now for us to actually create an order and have it flow through to Marketplace. So back over in Merchant Center, we're going to come home, and it quite handily gives you this option to place an order. So we're just going to create an order. So add an order. I'm going to select US dollars for my currency, click next. I'm going to select the US customer, next. And then here we select the product we want. So you can either provide the SKU or the variant key. So that's quite handy. We'll provide the marketplace or variant ID, select the US, and it's brought up our product. So this is another good check to make sure that the marketplace or variant ID has been attached successfully. So let's add that to our cart. Next, select standard shipping, next, and we'll now place our order. And we have our order created. Fantastic. So if we come over to our instance of Marketplace now, we should expect to see that order. So over in the operator portal, under orders, all sales, scroll down, we will see an order that's just been placed for a cardigan. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this order ID, which is the Marketplace or order ID, so 10376, copy that. And bringing Insomnia back onto the screen, I'm going to use another query against the Marketplace or Operator API to retrieve an order. And in this case, the query happens to be called invoices. Just as an FYI, order objects get created in Marketplacer, and they also have what are called invoices. You actually get one invoice per seller participating on the order, of course, because it's a marketplace. So again, if we purchased 3-line items in the commercetools front end, conceivably they could be listed by 3 separate sellers that exist in Marketplace, in which case you would have one invoice per seller. Okay, and so in effect, an order in Marketplace always has at least one invoice. And to be honest with you, it's usually the invoice object in Marketplace that is the more active object as opposed to the order. So we have this rather elaborate, very powerful invoices query that allows us to pull out, amongst other things, orders related to the invoices. So let's put in what's called the legacy ID. So that was 10376, click send. It's brought back the order and the external IDs on that order. And you can see here we have a external ID that's been added that has the commercetools ID that was created. All right, so that brings us to the end of our tutorial, and it brings us to the end of both of our main connected integration flows, both product and orders.